Hello and welcome to NAS Compares. If you've come to this video, chances are you're doing it because you've either bought a brand new QNAP NAS or you're on the verge of buying a QNAP NAS and you want to know just how straightforward it is to set up. We've been covering the subject of NAS, turnkey NAS, from brands such as QNAP and others for a number of years. And although we released a full detailed 9-part series on setting up your QNAP NAS from scratch back at the start of 2022, time moves on, and that was 2 years ago, even more by the time you're watching this, and things have changed with the software. Certain security defaults have changed the presentation of the GUI, some of the ways the storage is laid out, and ultimately we thought now was the time to revisit the subject of setting up your QNAP NAS for the first time and guiding you through it step by step. Now this video is the first part in the series, and in this I'm going to be showing you the physical setup and installing the software for the first time. Future parts in this series that should arrive pretty regularly are going to be covering setting up your shared storage areas, your volumes. You're going to be setting up a lot of your shared folders, your backup routines, your multimedia, your indexing, your security, your shares, that sort of thing. But this video is the physical setup and setting up your RAID, your redundant array of independent disks. And in order to pursue this guide, you're going to need a few things. What are you going to need? I'm glad you asked. Number one, you're going to need a QNAP NAS. Now for this video, I'm going to be utilising this one. This is the QNAP TS464. It's currently, at least at the time of recording, their fully featured mid-range 4-bay. There are other devices out there, and I would argue the majority of the steps in today's video apply to all QNAP NAS, with a few little exceptions that I'll touch on throughout the course of this video. The next thing you're going to need is your storage media. Now for this video, I'm going to be installing WD Red Pro 8TBs, but again, any drive you go for in SATA, as long as it's on a compatibility list, and I would argue there are lots of drives that aren't on that compatibility list that work, you can use. Now, the more astute of you may have noticed I've got 2 hard drives here, but this is a 4-bay system. Why is that? Later in this series, I'm going to be showing you how to expand your storage, because much like the importance of setting up the device right the first time, later on down the line, when you start running out of space, when you start running out of available capacity, you may want to scale up your storage. And later on, I will be showing you how to add more drives. But when you're buying your QNAP for the first time, one of the ways in which you can save yourself a little bit of bunts is to leverage the amount of money you're spending away from the storage and onto the device itself. In this case, I could have populated this with a bunch of 4TB or 6TB drives, but if I get a couple of 8TB drives, later on I can add more storage to those bays. You can run these systems with as little as 1 drive if you choose, so don't feel compelled on day one to fully populate the whole device. You don't have to. You can partially populate it as you go. That's why I'm only installing 2 drives. The other thing worth bearing in mind is, unlike brands such as Synology or TerraMaster, QNAP currently does not provide a flexible RAID configuration. What does that mean? That means it supports RAID 0, which combines all the drives. It supports RAID 1, which mirrors 2 drives. RAID 5, which combines all of the drives and provides 1 drive of failover or redundancy, or otherwise known as a safety net in case the drives die. RAID is not a backup, by the way. Or RAID 6 that provides 2 disks, or RAID 10 that pairs the drives together. Now, if I was to include later on a larger drive of 10TB, it would only see this drive as the smallest available drive. What does that mean? In brief, it doesn't matter if I put in this 8TB drive and filled the rest with 20TB drives. Whatever the smallest capacity is of any of those drives, it will see all of them like that. So don't bother trying to mix and match your drives. It won't make a difference. All the drives have to be the same. Now, you may be someone that's considering going for SSDs. SSDs for your storage, you can do that, 2.5-inch SSDs. The system can utilize that. You can even, interestingly, combine hard drives and SSDs together and create something called Q-tier, which combines hard drives and SSDs together. And we're going to make a full dedicated video just on Q-tier later, as it's quite a specialized setup. But if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, maybe look up Q-tier on YouTube here, or find one of our other guides. But for now, we're going to focus on those hard drives going inside for our main storage. Now, the next thing you might be looking at is M2 NVMEs. The salesman that sold you the QNAP, maybe the friend that recommended you get one, also said you should get some SSDs. Now, you may not need these. Do not feel that you have to buy them on day one, because it's not for everyone. SSDs like this can be utilised to used as raw storage pools, just like the hard drives, or they can be utilised for caching. Now, caching in its briefest form is when data is being sent to the drives or to the SSDs before it gets to the hard drives. When it comes to write cache and read cache is when more frequently accessed small data is copied to the SSDs to allow faster retrieval later. That's ultimately the shortcut of what caching is. And if that sounds like something you're going to use, then you maybe go for these. And again, you can use them as raw storage if you choose to as well. On top of that, you may be looking at accessories. Accessories for a device like this may be PCIe cards. They may be USB upgrades. There's lots of different upgrades available for the QNAP platform. If you're going to get one of these upgrade cards, if you're going to get NVMe to 2.5 inch adapters, if you're going to get 2.5 inch to 3.5 inch adapters, you can buy all of those things, but you don't need any of them at the beginning. So bear that in mind. Just because you don't buy them on day one doesn't mean you can't add them later on in most cases. Any other accessories you need will be included with your QNAP accessory pack. These will include your external PSU. These will include an Ethernet cable for you to connect later on. There may be screws, but 3.5 inch storage media does not require a screwdriver to be installed, but you will need a screwdriver if you choose to install 2.5 inch media for reasons you'll see in just a moment. So let's clear the table and begin the physical installation of our media. If you are considering installing both hard drive and SSD media inside your QNAP NAS on day one, I strongly recommend installing the SSD media first. During the course of the installation, you are going to be moving this device around, and that can lead to physical damage on your drives from motion, from shock, and more. So it's always recommended that you install the SSDs first. Now, the location of the SSDs, if you're going to choose to use M.2 NVMe's on your QNAP NAS, will differ. In the case of the TS464, you need to remove the front bay of the system and start removing the trays, and inside you will find the M.2 NVMe slots. More aggressive and larger business class systems such as the TVS H874 or the TS1685, these systems have the M.2 NVMe inside, and you will need to remove the entire enclosure. But as you can see inside here, we have got the slots for all of our upgrades, all located on the inside of this system. There's an L-shaped configuration in the case of this device. Go ahead and install your SSDs. They all will be marked with slot 1 and slot 2, but again, you won't need to worry too much about that. Again, installation is very straightforward, and inside you will find clips to attach your M.2 NVMe's inside directly. Now, a number of you may inquire on the subject of heat sinks. Heat sinks are these clips here. These provide a small metal cover on the top of your M.2 NVMe. Now, why would you need one of those? Well, SSDs like this one, unlike hard drives, which can achieve often speeds of around 260 to 280 megabytes per second at their total performance, in the case of M.2 NVMe's, these drives can hit thousands of megabytes performance, and that's without physical moving parts. But those M.2 NVMe's, to reach those speeds, get quite hot. And an SSD that reaches that heat, once it crosses 70 to 80 degrees, can do something called throttling, which reduces the performance in order to lower the temperature to prolong the SSD's life. That's why some users, myself included, recommend using heat sinks. However, there is not a black and white rule about this, because when it comes to heat sinks, if you're using a system that reduces the speed of the M.2 NVMe, such as the SSD slots on this are ×1 speed, that reduces the speed so much artificially with that downgrade that you're never going to need this heating. There just isn't enough heat being dissipated, or the required dissipation to draw the heat from the SSD into this panel and release it into the air. But more aggressive systems have ×4 speeds, and in those cases I would always recommend the use of a heatsink. So we've installed our SSDs. Next we want to use the hard drives. Grab your tray, and in the case of this QNAP, you just need to remove the side clips. The majority of QNAP NASs arrive in this form, by the way. Get your hard drive, make sure it is label up, and the SATA connector on the rear needs to go on the rear of this tray. You will feel it click into place, and then from there you simply need to reattach each of those clips. Again, remember, you don't need to fully populate the device on day one. You can go ahead and install 1 or even 2 drives to have that RAID functionality and then slot them neatly into the system. It's also recommended that you load from left to right, because these are named 1, 2, 3, 4, and the majority of QNAP NASs you will find will use that same layout of drives. This allows you later on, in the event of a drive failure and an alert being triggered, to not only utilize the LEDs on the front of the system to give you real-time information about the health of those drives, but also have a notification states on your phone or desktop device that say drive 2 is failing. It makes it a lot easier to identify that drive at a glance and not accidentally remove a drive that is healthy. Once you've installed those drives, go ahead, if you're going to not install any more drives, to install the empty drives, and then from there we'll need to connect our device up for the first time. Again, if you're using a system that has lockable trays, the reason for the lockable trays is to ensure that users cannot accidentally remove a drive. Now, the locks themselves are not enterprise quality. They are not difficult to break. Bear that in mind. They are not there to stop, thieves from stealing the drives. If they're going to do that, they're going to do it anyway, or they'll just take the whole box rather than the whole drives. They're simply there to stop users accidentally removing a drive and then trigger a RAID degradation. Same as this system having a front panel that simply click locks on the side. Some systems have a click lock, some systems have tray clips. Now if we move this system here, we can now talk about connecting this device up for the first time, because this is another area where you're going to have to make a decision moving forward. That decision is how this is going to communicate with the rest of your network and if you're going to give it internet connectivity. Because a lot of users, when they buy a NAS for the first time, don't realize that you don't need to actually connect this to the internet. You can just use a desktop mobile or a desktop computer device, a Mac, a Windows system, an Android system, a Linux system with Ubuntu, and you can just set this up with that device connected to the internet and this never being connected to the internet. So setting it up for the first time, we're going to be connecting the Ethernet cable here on the rear, but we can choose 2 ways. Number 1, we can go ahead and connect this device, if we choose, to a normal router. We can have a router supplied by our internet service provider, our ISP, and if we want, we can connect this to the rear of our QNAP NAS, and then the other end of the cable can go inside the router, again supplied by our internet service provider. What that means is this device now can be connected to the internet. You will have to use security protocol and reliance on the firewall of your router to make sure you've got protection there in place and making sure ports are blocked, but this system allows this to maintain and keep its own updates. It allows the system to be remotely accessible with the right security credentials and setting up a remote access portal. But most important of all, it means that the system can make sure it's got the latest firmware updates, as well as a more convenient means to run those updates within the system for individual apps and the whole system. More on that later on. But there are users that won't want to connect to the device directly, or they're going to have multiple users in their home or business environment that are going to be connecting with this device on their local area network. So that's not outside of the building, but in the building. Now, in those cases, it's recommended to grab yourself a network switch. Now, this one is a pretty enterprise switch. This wraps around for about 700 or 800 quid, but you can pick them up for as little as $15 to $20 for 1 gig 5-port switches there. In this case, if you connect the QNAP NAS to a switch, that means this device is accessible to every other device on this local area network, and then you can run this device into your router. That allows you to have 2 layers of security. It also allows you to separate all of these devices from the internet if you choose to communicate with the QNAP NAS, or within the functionality of your switch, ensure that this never has internet access, but everyone else does. It's a lovely way of doing that and allows you to separate your QNAP NAS from the wider area network. I am going to be connecting this device to a switch just slightly off camera there, which has internet connectivity but managed with higher security credentials there. Finally, after connecting network connectivity, the next thing you want to do is connect power. Now, in the case of this device, I've got an external power brick, but larger QNAP systems will have internal PSUs. What you want to do is first connect, and the next 2 steps you can swap depending on your own tastes, but personally, I always connect the power connector first into the QNAP NAS, and then I introduce the power. Again, you can do those the other way around depending on your own preference. You may hear a tiny click when you connect the PSU. That tiny click is simply the power being produced into the PSU, and look out for the little green light. So now we've got the system set up and ready to go. We've got our power, we've got our network connectivity. So in just a moment we're going to head over to my desktop PC and carry on with the rest of the installation. But when you're ready, go ahead and click the power button. The location of the power button will differ depending on your system. In this case, it is located on the top. The first thing the system does is check its system integrity by doing a very quick system check. Then it will boot the drives. You'll hear the click and hum of those drives as you do now. And that means the drives are now spinning up. The first time installation of this will result in the system getting ready for the bootloader. That beep says that the system is ready to rock. Now inside that bootloader there is a small area of flash storage known as an eMMC that has the bootloader, the installer for the QNAP QTS software installation. But they regularly update that software and there will be newer versions out there. So it's highly recommended that when you move over to your desktop computer to download a newer version. I'm going to show you exactly how to do that in just a moment. But for now, let's head over to my desktop PC and continue with the firmware and installation and the RAID setup. Setting up your QNAP NAS for the first time is going to differ ever so slightly depending on whether you want to allow the QNAP NAS access to the internet, and I'm going to show you just how to set the device up both with and without internet access on that NAS. Ensure that it has powered on and it's still on the local area network. Now head into QNAP's download section, find and filter down into the NAS that you're using, and you'll see a list of downloads available for you. If you intend to have the QNAP NAS set up with no internet access whatsoever, go ahead under operating system, download the latest version of QTS for your specific region. If you don't intend, intend for the QNAP NAS to have direct access to your router and internet access, you don't need to follow this step for reasons you'll see in a moment. The other tool I want you to download is in the utility section. In the utility section, scroll down to QFinder Pro. Find the Mac, Windows or Ubuntu Linux version, depending on your own hardware configuration of your PC, and download the version and install that tool. It's very straightforward and installs remarkably quickly. And once that's done, you will have the QFinder Pro application here. This allows you to scan your local area network and find your QNAP NAS. But moreover from that, it actually allows you, and later on you'll see more of this, the option to do a great deal more things with the NAS via this tool, such as changing the NAS's configuration, changing its network identity, mapping network drives, and more. Now, if you want a more broad network tool, I recommend checking out Advanced IP Scanner, a genuinely free tool. They don't sponsor this video. This is just a personal recommendation of a tool that I like to use. Use this tool to scan your local area network and not only find your QNAP NAS, but also other devices on the local area network. So if you choose to connect different IP cameras, multimedia devices and more, or even NAS to NAS backups, that tool will give you each device's identity and make the process a lot easier. But if what you want to utilize is QNAP specific apps, tools and services, then QFinder Pro gives you everything you need. Once you've ran that application and the QNAP NAS has been on and it's beeped in the background, the NAS will appear. Go ahead and double click. Once you double click, a new tab will open up in your web browser and allow you to start the installation and creation of both the QTS installation OS and your storage areas. If you want to extend your warranty up to 5 years, you can go ahead and do this, but you need to do it within the first 9 months of your purchase. You can skip that and come back to that later. Now, the first screen you're going to see is this one, inviting you to begin the QTS installation. Now, if you're running a more powerful QNAP system that supports the use of an app known as QUTS, the ZFS platform, you will be invited to choose between the two. The steps I'm going to show you are largely the same. The only difference between them is when you're actually utilizing them, because QUTS is a ZFS platform and a lot more capable, but no more for that complexity now. For now, let's go ahead and continue. Select Smart Installation, and then from there, click that you have read the terms and conditions if you have, and then click Next. The system will then invite you to do one of three things. 1, you can use the firmware installer that's on the system already, because all, as mentioned earlier on, all QNAP NAS systems have a small area of flash, a 5 gig eMMC flash module that has the bootloader and the installer on board. Alternatively, you can click Check for Update and it will search the internet for the latest version of the software installer. But bear in mind, again, if you do that, the QNAP NAS will need to have internet access. Or if you've already downloaded that software as I showed you earlier on, you can go ahead, select Upload Version, select Browse, find the QNAP installation that you've downloaded earlier on, which I've done there, and then click Update. And then it will update the NAS to that latest version of the software for the installation. Now, for myself, once you've got that updated firmware on board and you click Update, the system will upload that firmware. It will then apply it to the QNAP NAS and it will restart the system to restart the installer where we were just now. So let's fast forward to the reinstallation of this firmware and to carry on with the installer. Once you've downloaded or uploaded and installed that latest firmware, as mentioned earlier, the installer will restart. Go ahead and skip along just like you did before, and now of course you're going to be using that current version that you've upgraded on of QTS on this system. Go ahead and click Next. From here, the system will then invite you to create a name for your NAS as well as create a username. Now, I'm going to go for a light admin, but bear in mind when I've called it this name, that's not actually an admin or a root super hyper can do everything user, because QNAP have disabled that by default. You can re-enable it if you choose via the system configuration and control panel, but I would recommend leaving that disabled. Also, if you're going to be running multiple processes and multiple users from your QNAP NAS, such as individual family members, running multimedia devices, running backups, running surveillance and more, I do recommend creating individual user accounts for those individual users and processes, as it ensures that individual users do not have too much power and too much access to the system that either they can exploit or, worse still, compromised or vulnerabilities found in software allow that access to the NAS to be exploited. Later on in the control panel in the next part in this series, I'll show you how to create individual user accounts. But for now, go ahead and create our baseline control user, because this is the user who's going to be doing all of the installation and has as close as you're going to get to an admin account without full root access. Next, give the system a time. Again, if you're using internet connected NAS, then you can go ahead and do this automatically. Otherwise, you will have to do this manually. Next up, you can choose whether you want the IP address to be DHCP or automatic or a static IP address. Now, for most entry-level and beginner users, DHCP or an automatic IP makes the most sense. On your local area network or IP, every device from your phone to your TV to your computer all have an address, an IP, traditionally starting 192.168.1. And as devices disconnect and reconnect with the network when they're powered on or off, that IP address, when it's dynamic, can change. Now, what that can lead to is it makes it easier to find a dynamic device on the network more casually. Whereas, if you were connecting with the NAS in a very specific fashion, where you had regimented daily backups and regimented access from cameras or a NAS to NAS backup, in those scenarios, a static IP is heavily recommended, because in those scenarios, rigidity is going to be key to stability. but for everyone else, a dynamic IP makes a lot of sense. For example, if you set this NAS up and you're using it casually for multimedia, and then you move house and move the NAS onto a whole new network, chances are that dynamic IP will be significantly more useful as the system is configured to move around the network. But a static IP on an old network from an old building you just moved from will not likely be the same as your new network, and you'll have to go back into QFinder, go into the configuration option, and then from the configuration option have to go ahead and reassign the network identity. It can be a lot of work. So for most users, DHCP is the choice, but you can change that later. Next up, what do you want to do about updates? Now, this is going to be very important to a lot of users coming into the QNAP ecosystem, because there's a lot of users that are worried about software updates. Now, a lot of the problem with software updates, and I'm talking to you, Mr. I'm using the Mac, when the top right of the screen telling you that there's a new Mac OS firmware update, or you, the Android user, that keeps putting off that update. Updates are important on a NAS because this is a system that is on for 24/7, largely unattended. In most cases, it is better to have the latest updates installed. But I appreciate, as someone using a Windows 10 computer, I ain't upgrading to Windows 11 unless I have to. So to counteract these different ethoses and different attitudes, QNAP have introduced different ways to handle the updates. So you can choose to only install critical updates, only install quality updates. These are feature-rich updates that improve apps. Install all of the latest updates. Tell you when an update is available so you can manually install it, or never notify you of updates and never automatically update. I severely do not recommend that last one. Me personally, I would recommend critical updates minimum, and this will ensure that security updates are applied to your apps and services, and you can make sure that goes on at a certain time of day. The reason being that larger updates will result in the system needing to restart, and if you have access to the NAS happening 24/7 from different users, downtime of the NAS may be problematic. So this at least allows you to choose a specific time of day to look for updates and have those updates automatically applied. And there you go. All of the settings we've created need to be applied, double check they're correct, and click apply. Go ahead and click initialize. This doesn't create our RAID area, however. That happens later. For now, we'll let the system create our QTS installation, make our way into the graphical user interface, and I'll walk you through how to create your storage pool and volumes. Now that RAID configuration has completed, as we can see, a new splash screen has appeared. We can go ahead and go into the NAS management page for QTS or QUTS, depending on your own setup. Enter the login credentials that you created earlier on, and again, later on we'll be able to create things like two-factor authentication and OTP services, and I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. Go ahead and confirm if you want data privacy rules to allow your data to be shared or not, and that's analytical data, not system data, I should add. And from there, as you can see, the new storage and snapshot area will appear for you to allow you to help you create your area of storage. Now again, you can follow these guidelines if you want, and a lot of this will touch on stuff we've already talked about here, but I'll guide you through it all nonetheless in just a moment. Go ahead, click finish, and then from the storage pool area, if you don't want to share data by the way with QNAP, click no. From here, it will list all of the disks that have been installed inside your QNAP NAS, and as you can see, I've got 2 hard drives and 2 SSDs installed inside. So if you want to go ahead and create that storage pool area, and you've already closed the window that I showed you earlier, go ahead from there and select the 3 dots here, select manage free disks, and say you want to create a storage pool. If you want to create a storage pool, go ahead, then click next. From that storage pool area, go ahead and select whether you want to use Qtier, as mentioned earlier on, to combine your hard drives and storage. But if you don't want to utilize it and you want those SSDs to be something separate, go ahead and click next. The same goes if you want to use a self-encrypted drive, and it will require drives that support SSD services. You can go ahead and create that encrypted pool using those encrypted disks if you choose. From there, select the 2 hard drives if you want to use just a pure hard drive RAID pool, and then from there you can go ahead and select the RAID type that you want to utilize. So again, if you want these drives to just be loosey-goosey, select JBOD. JBOD will fill the first drive and then fill the second drive. That does still give you no redundancy, however. If any of those drives dies, you lose the data. RAID 0 is very similar, but this time the data is written across both of the disks repeatedly, but again, no safety net. Finally, RAID 1, the data is read and written simultaneously to the two disks, giving you an up to the second drive of data recovery if one of those drives dies, but bear in mind that is still a safety net, not a true backup. If you add more drives, you open the door to larger configurations, each of which give you one or two different redundant drive safety nets, and if you're using QUTS, the ZFS platform, you can take advantage of triple RAID redundancy as well as RAID 10, which is effectively the same as RAID 1, but multiple disks in their own bundles being read and written to simultaneously. For me, I'm going to select RAID 1, and remember, as you add more drives to your system, you can scale up that RAID accordingly. Next, pool allocation. You can choose how much of that storage pool is allocated for snapshots. Now, snapshots, you'll learn about more in our next video, are effectively blueprints of your data kept over time. So as long as you've got the original data, the snapshots basically take, as the name suggests, a snapshot blueprint of the data, and as data changes over time, it allows you to revert data back to a previous state, but you have to make sure you've kept all of the snapshots in between. The more snapshots you have, the more configuration control you have, and the reversal effect and the benefits it can bring. But just bear in mind, of course, that that takes up space. So you will need to reserve some of your system space for just those snapshots to ensure they are maintained. Personally, I would recommend at least 10%, but depending on your own storage configuration and how much you intend to fill up, they tend to recommend 20%. Also, you can do an alert threshold where you'll be given a notification if your storage area starts running out of space, and you can configure that accordingly. Next up, as you can see, it's just asking you to confirm what you have created. But bear in mind, right now we are creating a storage pool, not a volume, and there is an important difference. Now, if you are a QUTS user, you're not going to be using volumes, but for anyone that's utilizing one of the lower tier QNAP devices or a device running QTS, a storage pool is all of the drives, all lovely and laid out with all of our data there. Volumes are containers of storage that live on top of that layer. Think of it as the workspace, our sandbox. Now, if you choose, you can create one volume that has all of that available space. So if you've got 10 terabytes on your storage pool, if you like, you can create a 1 terabyte volume. But some users like to differentiate and separate one area of storage for backups, another area of storage for multimedia, and another area of storage for, say, surveillance or more. Now, of course, you could just create individual folders for these things, but some users like to make sure that data is separate, just in case one of them gets compromised, or so that they can easily allocate access for different users to different storage areas. So for those users, they like to create multiple individual volumes. The system will allow you to create as many volumes as you've got space on the pool for. For example, you can go ahead and create different kinds of volumes that allow you to expand it over time or restrict the size of it for the benefits of performance. You can even create some volumes that are bigger than the NAS they are in. All of these different volumes give you different benefits in terms of scalability, in terms of performance, and long-term utilization. And all of those will depend on you, the end user, which one of these sounds the most important to you, and what sounds like the way you're going to use the system. On-demand space that allows you to add more and scale it up later. Thick volumes that can be accommodated later, but storage is still pre-allocated, or a traditional one as found on a RAID. Personally, if you don't know what you're doing, I do recommend going for the on-demand space, as then you can still create those multiple volumes. And if you've created multiple pools, that's with your hard drives being broken down into smaller paddocks of storage, you can go ahead and select different ones. Alternatively, if you wish, go to create the pool there, let's zoom out again, and if you like, if you've got those SSDs inside, you can choose, if you wish, to turn those SSDs into their own standalone pool, and therefore create a new volume on that faster pool if you choose to, but more on that in a future video. Going back in, we'll go back into create our volume once again and go back to that window. Select on-demand space and the hard drive pool if you're looking for a nice, easy walkthrough. As you can see, you need to give your new volume a name. I'm going to call this one HDD pool. And then from there, say how much of the overall storage pool you want to allocate to this volume. Sorry, wrong one, vol. So for this, I'm going to allocate 3 terabytes of the available pool. And as you can see, as you set that, it will tell you just how much space is left over, and also those alerts and snapshot barriers you created earlier on. Next, choose whether you want to encrypt this volume. Now that means with this volume that you can create a USB key where it is needed to unlock this volume. What that means is the storage that you put in this encrypted volume, if the system is powered down and stolen and another person gets it, even if they have access to your username and password, if they don't have the key, this volume remains locked, and it's required for that key to allow you to unlock it. You can put the key on a USB or remotely access it via a desktop client like this. But ultimately, for those of you that are worried about your data being in a volume and someone accessing the NAS physically and stealing the device, that can be a great way to lock in your data into that volume and auto dismount it, or have the system automatically mount the volume on boot if you choose. Also, have the alert setting there, but as well as creating shared folders, you can do that automatically, or we can go ahead and create them manually later on in the file manager, something I'll be showing you in the next video. Next, you can also choose the kind of block size you want for this data. Now, this will depend on the kind of user you are. So for example, if you're utilizing larger sequential blocky data like multimedia, then you can go for larger block sizes. But if you're using databases filled with very small but high numbers of data, then smaller sizes, 4K nodes, make more sense. Ultimately, I would recommend leaving this at the default if you don't know what you are doing. Next, go ahead and click that button there. And if you want to enable snapshots of this volume, you can go ahead and enable them there. We'll be going into more detail on snapshots later on, and we've already discussed it a bit about those snapshots there. But you can go ahead and enable them on this volume on that option. Again, we're ready to go. Click finish, and now we've created not only our storage pool, we're now creating our storage volume for all of our data to live on. In our next video, we're going to be going into more detail about creating shared folders. What are the security credentials and protections we can afford to those shared folders? How to create brand new users, each of those individual users, the level of access and security they need, and utilizing those M.2 NVMEs as storage pools or caching. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you need more assistance, head over to NAS Compares. Take advantage on the right hand side of the screen here on the free advice section, where not only can we help you with our Discord and answering your questions within 3 to 5 days, but on top of that, you can go ahead and use some of these recommended forums, official community forums and subreddits, where you'll find out more information and assistance on your setup. If you need expedited support and faster support, we do have paid fast track support where we'll answer you in 24 hours, or you can use our own community forum or that Discord as mentioned, or you can head over to Ko-Fi or Patreon, where not only can you get expedited support, but you can join our membership tier, where not only can you get that fast support more regularly for a monthly subscription, access to priority content on our monthly Zoom, and more. Finally, if you need even more support, go to services, and we've got our Zoom consultation tier here, where we can do one-to-one and assist you with your storage needs and the right kind of configuration and device you need. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next part in this series.